So, what exactly is a genre? Well, it's basically a category, but when it comes to art, and in our case, literature, it includes a specific form or content or technique. And in our case, it's writing. So, recognizing that certain genres contain certain forms of writing that you find in one genre, but you don't find in another, or types of content that will be exclusive to a genre, or a writing technique, maybe word order, something like that, or how the words or how sentences and phrases are emphasized is going to be important and different between genres. When it comes to the study of the Old Testament, it really is important to know your genres. And so I'd like to take a few minutes and kind of just review some of the dominant genres that we find in the Old Testament, so that we could at least recognize that they exist and that we need to take care when we're reading our Old Testament to understand what genre is that particular work in, and that will help us to understand it and interpret it better. So genres obviously exist outside of the Bible. That's not a biblical thing. If you've ever been invited to a wedding, you've probably received a wedding invitation. A wedding invitation actually is a particular genre. It includes certain information, and in fact, it probably is written in a certain form that you have an expectation of as you receive or create a wedding invitation. You expect it to look a certain way, you expect it to have certain information like who's getting married, when are they getting married, where are they getting married. And if it's missing information that is key to that genre of a wedding invitation, then you're not going to understand the message as it's intended. So the same can be put forward toward Old Testament genres. If we don't understand the genre, we may misread it, or we may expect something to be there that's not a part of that genre and therefore is not going to be there. So why does genre matter? Genre matters because we want to understand the author's point and the details as the author intended them for the writing, but we can't do that if we don't understand the genre. Moving on to the genre types that we find in the Old Testament, I'm going to go over 6 different genre types. Now, that's not an exhaustive list. There are more genres. You could even label some subgenres that are within genres, but I want to hit the top types of genres that you'll find in the Old Testament, that if you recognize them, that your reading of the Old Testament will become easier and you'll gain more from reading it. The first one really covers the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and it's known as the law. And the law starts the Old Testament and was given to the people so that they could know how to live. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, while it's included in the law, it really doesn't have the law decrees in it. If you recall from reading Genesis and Exodus, Moses traditionally got the divine revelation of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, after the events of Genesis had already happened. So Genesis really answers the question for the people, where did we come from? And so we see a lot of narrative, which I'll get into in a moment, in Genesis, but it's still considered to be a law book, a law genre. The later books actually reflect the meaning of Torah better than Genesis might. Torah really means instructions. I know we understand it many times as law because of how it gets translated into the New Testament Greek, but in Hebrew, that word really means instructions, and that's what we see in the later books of the Torah, the Pentateuch, is instructions on how to live. So now that the Israelites know where they came from after Genesis and Exodus, now the rest of the books instruct them as to how to live. And so that's really the essence of the law genre. If you find this content helpful, please go ahead and click on the like button below and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified when we release new videos, please click the bell and you'll receive a notification of when we release new content. The second genre I'd like to talk about is the narrative genre. As I said, Genesis is primarily narrative, but so is a lot of the Old Testament. They're narrative stories of the people of Israel and their experiences. Narratives are not just meant to tell a story for information purposes, but to convey a message, to teach a lesson. And that's what we should take from reading the narratives of the Old Testament. Now, not all narratives are the same. They may have a particular focus, and we see that in the Old Testament. We can see narratives that have a tragic kind of story to them. Stories of Samson and Saul and King Solomon. We may see epic stories like the epic journey of 40 years through the desert by the people of Israel. Romance is also a type of narrative that we can see, and we have romance in the Bible, in the story of Ruth, for example. We have heroes in the Bible. We have Abraham and Gideon, and of course King David and Daniel. And so we are told about their heroic journeys and stories. We even have satire in the Bible. Many consider Jonah to be a story of satire, poking fun at the normal, in a sense, the prophetic memes of the Bible. And Jonah pokes fun at those. And we also have polemics. That's when the Bible speaks out against either other nations or idolatry, other gods. Elijah's story of the fire and the killing of the Baal prophets is a good example of a polemic story intended to promote God and to take down God's opponents. A third genre of the Old Testament is well known, and it's that of wisdom literature. Now, wisdom literature isn't necessarily telling a story, though it can kind of tell a story as it's promoting its wisdom, but its chief purpose is to teach wisdom and to bring forth those lessons in its story so that we can become more wise, really, by reading them. There are two different kinds of wisdom literature that we find in the Old Testament. One is kind of short, little pithy sayings, and you're probably familiar with that from Proverbs. Hence, we get the word proverbial. These are examples of wisdom, but given in a small, easily read, easily understandable package. And of course, we get that from the book of Proverbs. There are also longer examples that we see in the books of Ecclesiastes, where the question is asked, what is the meaning of life? And the book of Job, where it is sort of a narrative, but it's really wisdom-based. It's for the reader to be able to walk a mile in Job's footsteps and to really feel the questions that he's asking of God regarding his life. And so he also, in a sense, has the question of what is the meaning of life, given what's happening in his life. So wisdom literature is another of the genres that we'll find in the Old Testament. The next genre category is that of prophecy. It's one of the most well-known genres contained within the Old Testament, are the prophetic books written by the prophets. It's also one of the very most challenging genres to read because it typically is full of details about the future, but also given in figurative or symbolic language. So that makes it hard to nail down details sometimes when we read prophecy. And not all prophecies are written for the same intended purpose. Some of them, of course, are predictions of future events let's say, messianic prophecies for the anticipation of the coming of the Messiah someday, but also other prophecies are intended to be more general warnings of coming judgment when the day of the Lord will finally come. Some of them are intended to give an overview of what God is doing. It's one of the biggest questions people have regarding the Bible is, what is the bigger story? What is God doing in our world, and what are his intents and purposes for mankind? Prophecy many times will give us some structure and hints as to what is going on in God's agenda. And therefore, it's also many times a challenge for the people to live in God's ways. And those can still apply to us as well. Not all prophecy has come about yet. So just as the Israelites of the Bible times were challenged to follow their God and anticipate what he was doing, we have to do the same thing today. Another challenging genre for us to read in the Old Testament is the fifth genre I want to bring up, and that's poetry. The reason it's challenging is not only because it's poetry. Poetry in our own language might be challenging for many, but for us in a Western audience, poetry that originates from the ancient Near East is even more challenging. There are forms and tropes that are present in ancient Near Eastern poetry that we don't have in our modern Western poetry. So it's difficult for us to pick those up. One of the most distinguishing features of Hebrew poetry in particular is what's called parallelism. And there's debate about parallelism versus other forms of that, but it's generally accepted that we can read Hebrew poetry and see forms that say something and then say something similar with different words in the next line, and that will be a type of parallelism. Or perhaps one line will say something, make a statement, and the next line will be a contrasting statement. And that is still parallelism, but it's contrastive types of parallelism. This is something we don't see typically in Western poetry, so it's harder for us to pick up if we're not aware of it. There's also a form known as a chiasm, which is kind of a hierarchical structure of saying something, saying A, then B, then C, and then moving back to another statement related to B and another statement related to A. And if you can visualize that, that's kind of creating a form that ends up being A, B, C, B, A. And it's known as a chiasm. And that's very prevalent, both in poetry as a genre, but it's also inserted here and there in narrative places when the author wants to get creative. Speaking of that, sometimes we'll see poetry in large collections like the Psalms, or a collection of 5 poems about a specific event like the Book of Lamentations, which all have to do with one particular historical event, the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. We'll also see poetry, though, embedded in other areas of the Old Testament. We know of songs like Deborah's song or Hannah's song in 1 Samuel, or Miriam's song in Exodus. So we'll see those also as examples of poetry embedded in the middle of a narrative. And we need to recognize when we're shifting from narrative to poetry so that we understand how to interpret those sections of Scripture correctly. And the final biblical genre that we find in the Old Testament that I'd like to bring to you today is known as apocalyptic. Now, it's a bit ironic that this genre is called apocalyptic because that has been named after the book of Revelation, which is a New Testament book. Of course, if you're familiar with the meaning of Revelation, it's really apocalypsis, and it means the revealing. But there are Old Testament books that have this sort of genre form to them, and they've now been labeled with this New Testament name of apocalyptic. They are prophetic in nature, as the genre is, usually talking about future events, but they're more than just pure prophecy because they typically will have these motifs and imagery, symbols of destruction and disaster associated with them, along with the prophetic end times kind of message that comes along with the apocalyptic genre. We see this exhibited in parts of Daniel, in Ezekiel, and parts of Zechariah. So we need to recognize when those sections of those books are expressing the apocalyptic genre so that we do not misunderstand what's going on there and why it is written in the way that it is. Understanding biblical scripture and understanding the genres in which it was written is really vital if we have any hope of being able to apply it to our lives and understand it correctly. Something else that's really important and valuable is to be able to read the Old Testament in its original language. And if you're interested in doing that, I encourage you to check out bma.to/starterpack for more information as to how you can begin a journey on learning biblical Hebrew and therefore read the Old Testament in its own language. Knowing the original language and knowing the biblical genre of the Old Testament will really contribute to a better understanding of the author's intention for us. And of course, that author is God. And so we want to hear his word and apply it into our lives so that we can serve him better. And I hope I've served you today in some way through this video. Until I get a chance to talk to you again, Shalom.